Welcome to Detective Reddington's office. Take a seat and listen to this story. It will be interesting. When Lisa started working as a recruiter at a new IT company, I was happy for her. It was a great opportunity. A startup growing fast, and she loved working with people. We'd always supported each other, so I had no reason to doubt her sincerity. But you know how it is. Sometimes, even the most trusting people notice those small, almost invisible changes. First, it was little things. She started coming home later, talking more and more about the specialists she was interviewing. It didn't raise any alarms. Recruiters have tough jobs, especially in a growing company. We're just flooded with interviews right now. Everyone wants to work here. She'd often say when I asked why she wasn't home by 8. One day stands out particularly clearly. She mentioned a new candidate, a guy named Jake. She even giggled a bit when talking about him. He's talented. I think he'll be the star of our team, she said, with just a little too much excitement. But I didn't give it much thought at the time. Week after week, she stayed later and later at work. I tried to be understanding, knowing how crazy work can be at startups. But something started to bother me. Maybe it was how often she mentioned Jake, or how much time they were spending together in the office. We work a lot together, she'd say when I asked. And then came the day that turned my life upside down. Lisa came home late as usual. But this time, she looked more tired and tense than usual. She didn't even say hello, just dropped her bag in the hallway and went straight to the shower. She's usually so meticulous. She never leaves her things lying around. But that night, something was different. I stood in the living room, listening to the water running in the shower, feeling something was wrong. I glanced at her bag, lying on the floor. The feeling that I needed to find something was almost physical. I don't know what made me look inside, but when I opened it, I saw something that literally stopped my heart. There was a small pack of condoms. I stood there staring at it, as if I'd seen a ghost. I picked up the pack, and noticed 2 of them were missing. That moment felt like a punch to the gut. In an instant, everything clicked. Her late nights, constant meetings with Jake, all the work-related excuses that once seemed normal. She'd been lying to me. I stood in the hallway, clutching that pack of condoms, trying to keep control. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. How long has this been going on? Was it only Jake? Did it happen tonight? I heard the water in the shower stop, and Lisa stepped out, wrapped in a towel. She didn't even notice me and went straight to the bedroom. I knew I couldn't just storm in with questions. No, I had to be smart, careful. If she was cheating, I needed more evidence. But this was the beginning of the end, and I knew it. After that night, I couldn't sleep anymore. Even when I did drift off, it was only in short, restless moments. I lay in bed thinking about those damn condoms in Lisa's bag. My imagination painted pictures of what might have been happening while she stayed late at work. Jake, the 2 of them, her office. In the morning, she acted as if nothing had changed, totally calm and collected. She made breakfast, kissed me on the cheek, and rushed off to work. All those little details of our everyday life, which had once seemed normal, now irritated me. Her fake cheerfulness only made me more suspicious of everything she said. How could she be so calm after what she was doing behind my back? I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my cup of coffee, and all I could hear was the sound of the door clicking shut as she left. It was like something had locked inside my head. I had to do something. My first thought was to go straight to her office, just walk right in and confront them. But that wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't make a scene without more proof. No, I had to wait. I had to gather more information. But how? And then I remembered her phone. It was the key. But Lisa always kept it with her, and recently it was always locked. I didn't know her password, and asking for it now would make her suspicious. But sometimes she left it lying around when she went to the shower or the kitchen. That's when I could check it. That evening, when she stayed late at work again, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My fingers twitched, and I found myself replaying her words in my head. The company's growing, projects are piling up, and I can't leave things unchecked. It all sounded so reasonable, and I used to believe it. But now, knowing about her affair with Jake, every word felt like a lie. I had to do something. I opened her laptop. The The same work emails, the same routine messages. Nothing suspicious except one. An email from Jake. Not too formal, but not too personal either. Thanks for helping with the documents today. Maybe we can repeat it tomorrow after work. Repeat what? I thought. After work? This was more than just work, and I knew it. My heart started pounding even harder. I needed to confront her, but not yet. First, I needed more proof. When Lisa finally came home that night, I watched her closely. She left her bag in the hallway again, took off her heels, and collapsed on the couch, exhausted. I didn't say a word. Her latest excuses were still spinning in my head. She fell asleep quickly, and I stayed up in the dark, staring at her phone charging on the nightstand, wondering how much longer I could take this. The next morning, I knew I had to be ready for anything. The situation was worse than just losing trust. It was a betrayal of everything we had built together. And I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Great. I'll continue translating the next parts. Here's the continuation. The next few days dragged on like an eternity. I tried to act normal, asking Lisa about her day, listening to her talk about interviews and candidates. But every word she spoke felt hollow, and I no longer believed anything she said. Every lie just pushed me further into action. I started planning. If I was going to find out the truth, I couldn't act on impulse. I couldn't just barge into her office and accuse her. I needed hard evidence. Real, undeniable proof that she was cheating on me with Jake. I decided to start watching her more closely. It seemed crazy, but I had no other choice. The next night, when she said she'd be working late again, I decided to follow her. Inside, I felt sick about what I was doing, but I was ready to do whatever it took to get to the bottom of this. I waited until she left the house, and after a few minutes, I followed her. She drove to the office, but instead of parking in her usual spot, her car continued down the street. I kept a safe distance, trying not to be noticed. She parked near a downtown restaurant, and I immediately knew this wasn't a work meeting. My heart was racing as I parked a few blocks away and saw her get out of the car. Lisa didn't look like a woman heading for a business dinner. She was wearing a black dress she usually reserved for special occasions, for parties or our anniversaries. I watched her walk toward the restaurant, and a cold rage boiled inside me. A few minutes later, another car pulled up, and there he was, Jake. I had only seen him in the company's social media photos. Tall, lean, the same guy she called talented. They entered the restaurant together, and I stayed in my car, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was ready to storm in there and blow everything up. But something held me back. I needed more evidence. More than just seeing them enter a restaurant together. I decided to wait until they left. Sitting in the car, the minutes felt like hours. I imagined what they were talking about, whether they were touching each other under the table, maybe even planning their future together. After about 2 hours, they finally walked out. Jake escorted her to her car, and then it happened, the thing I feared the most. He leaned in and kissed her. My world shattered in that moment. All the pain, all the doubts, they were now my reality. I stood frozen for a second, trying not to lose control. Then I realized this was just the beginning. I had more questions than answers, but at least now I knew. Lisa was cheating on me, and this was only the first step toward the truth. When she came home that night, I was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I heard her quietly enter the room, change clothes, and slip into bed beside me. Her scent only made me angrier. The smell of the restaurant and maybe something else, something unfamiliar. How could she lie next to me so calmly after all that? She thought her secret was safe, but I knew. And now it was just a matter of how I'd handle it. The next few days felt like they were stretched out forever. Lisa became even more distant. Her late returns home were the new normal, and I stopped asking where she had been or what she was doing. Everything she said sounded empty, and I no longer trusted any of it. But each lie only fueled my need for action. I'd already decided what I had to do. The truth was no longer a question of if, but when. I needed undeniable proof, something so solid that she couldn't weasel out of it. And the only way to get that proof was through her phone. That night, when she left her bag in the hallway again and headed straight for the shower, I made my move. I'd been preparing for this. I found an app that could track her phone without leaving any traces. All I needed was a few minutes with her phone. I knew it was wrong, that it was an invasion of her privacy, but hadn't she done the same to me? To my life? To my trust? Lisa came home late again, exhausted but with a strange satisfaction on her face. She left her bag in the hallway and went straight to the shower like before. This was my chance. I went to her bag and quickly found her phone. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid she might hear it. The phone was locked, but I tried our anniversary date. This time it worked. I quickly installed the app and returned the phone to its place, hoping she wouldn't notice anything. The whole thing took less than a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When she came out of the shower, she looked completely at ease. She chatted with me like usual, but I no longer listened. In my head, there was only one thought: now, I will know everything. Over the next few days, I waited and watched as she continued to lie, as her phone buzzed with constant messages. And then there it was, a message from Jake. Shall we do it again after work? Is your office free? My heart sank. This wasn't just a work conversation. It was confirmation that something was happening between them, and that it wasn't just a one-time thing. I kept watching her over the next few days. Each night, her phone buzzed with more messages from Jake. And each time, she lied to my face about why she was staying late at work. But now I had the evidence. Their messages, their plans to meet after work, their talks about how they did it again. Now I knew the truth. Lisa was cheating on me. A cold determination settled over me. I knew the next step was deciding what to do with this knowledge. And now, with everything in my hands, it was up to me how this would play out, and how much I wanted to make her pay. Thank you. I'll continue translating without interruptions. Here's the next part. My anger was boiling inside, but now I was playing the long game. I had enough evidence to destroy her. Their messages, the photos of their cars parked together outside the office. But I wanted more. More so that she wouldn't have a single chance to deny or escape the consequences. And worst of all, I wasn't sure what angered me more: the betrayal itself or the way she continued to pretend like nothing was happening. The next few days, I watched her every move. She was careful, but not careful enough, not like she would have been if she knew I already knew. I started noticing little things. How she stayed longer in the shower after her late meetings. How she meticulously packed her bag in the morning before heading to work. None of it seemed innocent anymore. Every action made me more suspicious, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized she wasn't going to stop. She was too deep into her affair with Jake. One evening, while she was once again late at the office, I decided to check her things again. I had already installed the tracking app on her phone, and each conversation between her and Jake was in my hands, but I needed more tangible proof. Something physical, something I could throw in her face when the time came. Opening her bag, I found what I was looking for. Another pack of condoms, and again several were missing. The pattern repeated itself, but this time I was ready for it. I held them in my hand, contemplating what would come next. It was all too predictable, her lies, her affair. But what was next? I put the condoms back and zipped up her bag as if nothing had happened. It was only a matter of time before she slipped up again. I couldn't wait any longer. Everything pointed to another meeting with Jake. That night, when she came home, I met her at the door, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked slightly surprised to see me standing there. Maybe she didn't expect me to be home so early. "You don't look too tired from work?" I said casually, trying to sound only mildly curious. She nodded, offering a small, nervous smile. "Yeah, today was a tough day, but it's all good." Her eyes didn't quite meet mine, and I knew she was lying again. She was a master of those small lies, the ones that usually seem innocent but slowly build into something much bigger. Inside me, the desire to confront her right there and then was rising, but I held back. I wanted more. A few days later, I decided it was time to take the next step. I couldn't wait anymore. I booked a small camera to install at home. It was crazy, but I needed to know everything that happened when I wasn't there. She had become too careful with her phone and messages, but if she was doing this in her office, who knew if she'd eventually bring him home. It was a brutal decision, but I was ready for anything to get to the truth. I installed the camera in her home office, where she often worked late at night. Now I had eyes where she felt the safest. And sure enough, one evening, she did exactly what I had feared. Lisa left her phone on the table when she went to the shower, and another message from Jake came through. "Meet tomorrow after work? I miss you." She replied almost immediately. Of course, the office will be free as usual. That night, as she went to sleep, I couldn't close my eyes. I knew tomorrow would be the climax. Tomorrow she would meet Jake again, and I would be there to witness everything. I had a plan. Not to interfere right away, not to make any rash moves. I wanted to see them together, wanted to capture that moment when everything would come crashing down for her. I wanted her to see that I knew, and for her world to collapse just like mine had. The next morning felt like a countdown. Every minute dragged on, but I knew that today was the day. Everything I had planned, every careful step I had taken, had led me to this moment. I played over the possible scenarios in my head, imagining how it would all end. I had to stay calm, focused, and most importantly, not let my emotions get the best of me before I had everything I needed. Lisa acted as she always did. She was cheerful at breakfast, talking about work, even mentioning new candidates she was going to interview that day. But I knew it was all part of her game. Jake. His name came up again in the conversation, and I felt a tightness in my chest, but I maintained my composure. I played along, nodding, pretending everything was fine. "Are you staying late again tonight?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Yeah, we have a lot of work," she replied without looking at me. "The project's almost finished, and I can't leave the team hanging." My heart was pounding so hard I thought she might hear it, but I gave nothing away. In my head, there was only one thought. Tonight, everything changes. When Lisa left for work, I waited until she was out of sight before starting my preparations. I checked the camera I had installed in her home office a few days ago. Everything was set, the video and audio were high quality, so I could capture every move when the time came. It was only a matter of hours. Then I drove to her office. I knew I needed to stay hidden, but I already knew where to park without being noticed. I had scouted the place before, and now I had a plan. When I got there, I parked a few blocks away and waited, watching the entrance to the building. After some time, her car appeared. She parked in her usual spot, and I already knew Jake wouldn't be far behind. He showed up about 10 minutes after she did. They both walked into the building, confident that no one was watching them. I felt my anger boil again, but I held myself back. It wasn't time yet. I gave them some time to settle inside. My goal was clear: to capture everything on video to get the evidence I could use for full exposure. I wanted her lies and betrayal to be seen not just by me but by everyone around her. I wanted her to lose everything she was trying to hold on to: her reputation, her career, the respect of her colleagues. About 30 minutes later, I decided it was time. I walked up the stairs to the second floor, where her office was. My steps were quiet, even though a storm of emotions was raging inside me. I carefully approached the door. The blinds were tightly drawn, but I could hear muffled voices from inside. My hand reached for the door handle, but I stopped. This was the moment of truth. I could open the door right now and tear their world apart. But I knew it would be too soon. I decided to play it smarter. I pulled out my phone and started recording a video through a small crack in the door, which I barely nudged open. They were there, just the two of them. Lisa was sitting on the desk, and Jake was standing next to her, leaning in. They were talking softly, but I heard enough to understand this wasn't just a friendly conversation. Everything about their body language screamed that this was more. They were talking about something intimate. I couldn't catch every word, but I didn't need to. I kept filming quietly, making sure they didn't notice. The fact that I stood there, right outside the door, and they had no idea, filled me with a strange sense of control. They didn't know their little world was about to collapse. When I had enough footage, I stopped recording and quietly stepped away. I didn't need to confront them just yet. I had a much bigger plan. I walked back to my car, trying to steady my thoughts. I knew there were still more steps ahead, but today I had made an important one. I had the proof, and now it was all up to me when and how I would use it. This time, when Lisa came home that night, I wasn't the husband she could deceive anymore. Now I was the one playing the game. The next day felt like every minute dragged on forever. I knew that today would be the key moment. All of my planning, every careful move had led me to this point. My mind kept replaying how it would all unfold, and I had to remind myself to stay calm, focused, and keep my emotions in check until the right moment. Lisa went about her day as usual. She was cheerful at breakfast, chatting about work, even mentioning new candidates she'd be interviewing. But I could already see through her. Jake's name popped up again during the conversation, and it took all my willpower to suppress my anger. I played along, nodding, acting as though nothing was wrong. "Will you be staying late again tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Yeah, we have a lot to wrap up," she answered, her eyes focused on her coffee. "The project is almost done, and I need to make sure everything's in order." My heart pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "That makes sense." When Lisa left for work, I waited until she was gone before making my move. I knew today would be the day. The camera I installed at home was ready, capturing everything that happened in her office, and I had the footage from last night. Now it was just about when and how I would reveal everything. By the time the afternoon rolled around, I drove to her office. I knew exactly where to park so I wouldn't be noticed. I'd scouted out the area before, and today all that preparation would finally pay off. I found a spot far enough away, but where I could still see the entrance. It wasn't long before her car pulled into the parking lot. I watched as she parked, got out, and walked toward the building. A few minutes later, Jake arrived. His car pulled up next to hers, and they both walked inside, thinking no one knew what they were doing. But I was there, watching every move. I waited, giving them time to get comfortable. It wasn't enough to catch them entering together. I needed undeniable proof. I wanted to ruin everything they thought they had hidden. Lisa wasn't just going to lose me. She was going to lose everything. After about 30 minutes, I knew it was time. I stepped out of my car, walked around the building, and found a spot just outside the window of her office. I could hear faint voices inside, but the blinds were drawn. I couldn't see them, but I didn't need to. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the small crack in the blinds, just enough to catch their silhouettes, to hear their muffled voices. I captured every word that mattered. They talked softly, intimate whispers about their plans, about how they would do it again. That was all I needed. I recorded for a few more minutes, then stepped back, my heart pounding. I felt a strange sense of power knowing they were completely unaware that I was standing just a few feet away from their dirty little secret. I had everything I needed. I didn't need to confront them right then and there. No, I had a much bigger plan in mind. When I got back to my car, I sat for a moment, catching my breath. Felt like I had just crossed a line. There was no turning back now. What came next would be the final blow, the one that would destroy their little world. When Lisa came home that night, she looked tired but happy. She smiled at me as she dropped her bag in the hallway, like everything was completely normal. But I knew the truth. She had no idea what was coming. I watched her carefully as she made small talk about work, about her busy day. She had no clue that I had followed her, that I had all the evidence I needed. But I didn't let her see any of that. I kept playing my part, waiting for the right moment. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, everything comes crashing down. The next day, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. I knew today was going to be the day everything changed. Lisa went about her morning as usual, and I pretended nothing was different. But inside, I was already planning my next move. Today was a big day for Lisa at work. The company had scheduled an important meeting, one where all the senior staff would be present, including Jake. It was the perfect opportunity to bring everything to light. I had coordinated with Mark, one of our mutual friends who also worked in her company. He agreed to help me set everything up. He didn't know all the details, but he knew enough to understand that Lisa had been cheating on me, and he wanted to help. After Lisa left for work, I spent the morning preparing. I gathered all the evidence, the messages between her and Jake, the photos, and the videos I had recorded. Everything was neatly organized in a folder, ready to be shown. It was going to be a public reveal, something she would never see coming. When the time came, I headed to her office. Mark had arranged for me to be there without Lisa knowing. As soon as I arrived, he met me in the parking lot, his face tense with anticipation. "You ready for this?" Mark asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a cold resolve settle over me. "It's time." We walked into the building together, and I waited in the hallway while Mark went into the conference room where the meeting was taking place. A few minutes later, I got the signal. It was time. I stepped into the room quietly, standing at the back. Lisa hadn't noticed me yet. She was too focused on the meeting. The senior management team was there, along with her coworkers and, of course, Jake. I could feel the tension in the room as I walked up to the front, my heart pounding, but my face calm. Mark stood up from his seat and cleared his throat. "Before we continue with today's agenda, there's something else that needs to be addressed." Lisa finally noticed me. Her eyes widened in surprise, and I could see the confusion on her face. She wasn't expecting me to be here, and she definitely wasn't expecting what was about to happen. I plugged a USB drive into the projector and turned on the screen. The first image that appeared was a photo of her and Jake's cars parked together outside the office, late at night. Whispers spread through the room. People began looking at each other, murmuring, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Lisa sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the screen. She hadn't said a word yet, but I could see the panic starting to creep in. The next images were the messages between her and Jake. Their plans to meet after work, their flirtatious conversations, their shared moments of intimacy. And then I played the video, the one I had recorded the day before where they were talking in her office, too close to be just colleagues. The room went silent. Everyone was watching the screen, and I could feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just a private betrayal anymore. This was a public humiliation. Lisa's face went pale. She looked around the room, her mouth slightly open, as if trying to find something to say, but no words came out. "Lisa," I said, my voice steady but filled with the anger I had been holding back for weeks. "Do you want to explain to everyone what's going on here?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She looked at me, then at the screen, then at Jake, who was sitting silently next to her, his face now as white as hers. "This is work-related," she stammered, her voice shaking. "It's just, we were working late, and this isn't what it looks like." I almost laughed. "Working late? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with him. You think this is just work? Then explain these messages. Explain why you're meeting in your office late at night, why you're carrying condoms in your bag." Her face crumpled. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't care. This was what she deserved. The room was silent, and all eyes were on her. The woman who had spent so much time building a reputation for herself, for being a successful professional, was now being exposed as a cheater. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "Jake," I said, turning to him, "you want to explain your role in this? Or are you going to pretend this is just work too?" Jake said nothing. He just sat there, staring at the floor. His career was over, and he knew it. "We're done, Lisa," I said, my voice cold and final. "Our marriage is over. You betrayed me. You lied to me. And now everyone knows the truth." She broke down then, covering her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. But I wasn't moved. I had seen enough. I grabbed my things and walked out of the room without looking back. This wasn't just the end of our marriage. It was the end of her charade. Her world had come crashing down just like mine had weeks ago. As I walked out of that room, it felt like the weight of all those weeks of doubt, suspicion, and lies had finally lifted off my shoulders. But the relief I felt was cold. I stood outside the office, watching people pass by, thinking about how my life had just changed forever. I knew there was no future with Lisa anymore. Our marriage was over, and it wasn't just about the fact that she had physically cheated on me. She had betrayed my trust, my feelings, our history, everything we had built together. She had turned our relationship into a lie. And now, knowing that, I wanted nothing more to do with her. I got into my car and drove home. The road seemed longer than usual. My mind was racing, but one thing was clear. I couldn't live under the same roof with her anymore. I needed to leave, to clear my head, to figure out what came next. When I got home, I started packing my things. My hands were trembling as I threw clothes into a suitcase. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching myself from a distance, going through the motions. I had spent the last few weeks focused on one thing, exposing her betrayal. And now that it was done, I suddenly realized I didn't know how to move forward. I packed most of my clothes when my phone buzzed. It was Mark. "How are you, John?" he asked. I paused before answering. How was I? It was a difficult question to answer. "I'm okay, I guess," I said, trying to sound more certain than I felt. "I did what needed to be done." Mark exhaled on the other end of the line. "Everyone in the office is in shock. Lisa hasn't left yet, but I think she will soon. I don't know what's going to happen to Jake, but I think he's in serious trouble. They deserve it," I said bitterly. "I just want to move on now. I'm filing for divorce." Mark was quiet for a moment, then he said softly, "It's going to be tough, but you made the right decision. If you need anything, you know where to find me." "Thanks," I replied shortly, and hung up. Mark was right, this was going to be tough. Lisa wasn't going to give up easily. I already knew her next move would be to try to save what was left. She would try to explain it all as a mistake, beg me for forgiveness, maybe even try to win me back. But I wasn't going to listen. That part of my life was over. After packing up the rest of my things, I placed my bags by the front door and stood there, thinking, what now? Where to go? I didn't have a clear plan for what came next, but I knew I couldn't stay in this house any longer. And just at that moment, the door opened. Lisa had come home earlier than I had expected. She stood in the doorway, panic in her eyes when she saw me standing there with my bags. "John?" she whispered, her voice soft, almost pleading. "Let me explain." I met her gaze, but I no longer felt the emotional pull I had once had for her. I didn't feel hurt anymore, just emptiness and cold resolve. "There's nothing to explain, Lisa," I said, my voice firm. "You cheated on me. I'm done listening to your excuses." "It was a mistake," she said, stepping closer, trying to reach out to me, but I stepped back. "It was just a mistake, John. I don't know what came over me, but I'm ready to fix it. Please, just give me a chance to make it right." I shook my head, the bitter smile forming on my lips. Did she really believe I could just forget everything? "Make it right," I scoffed. "You've been cheating on me for months, lying, sneaking around, and now you want to make it right? I've seen all your messages, seen what you've been doing. There's no chance, Lisa. We're done." I watched as her face crumbled in pain and shame. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they no longer moved me. I had gone through every emotion possible, from shock to anger, and now there was only emptiness. "Please, John," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I made a horrible mistake, but we can fix this. I love you." "No, Lisa," I interrupted. "You don't love me. You love yourself and your own desires. And now you're going to face the consequences." I grabbed my bags and headed for the door. She tried to say something else, but I didn't want to hear it anymore. I opened the door and took my final step. "Goodbye, Lisa." I walked out of the house, leaving her behind, and this time for good. As I walked away from the house, I felt something strange. Not relief, not satisfaction. It was more like emptiness, a quiet calm that comes after the storm. I made my way to my car, threw my bags into the back seat, and sat behind the wheel, staring at the road ahead. Where to now? My mind had been completely focused on exposing Lisa's lies, on making her pay for what she'd done. But now, with that behind me, I realized I had no idea what came next. My marriage was over. The home we had built together, the plans we made for the future, all of it was gone. I no longer had a direction. All I had was my freedom, but it felt heavy and empty at the same time. There was no joy in walking away from Lisa, though I knew it was the right decision. I decided to check into a hotel for the night. It was late, and I knew I just needed a place to crash, to clear my head, and figure out what I would do next. The drive felt endless, but my mind was spinning. All this time, I had been focused on one thing, getting revenge, exposing her, but now it was done. And here I was, sitting in my car, on the side of the road, realizing that life after betrayal wasn't going to get easier just because I walked away. When I arrived at the hotel, I felt exhausted, physically and emotionally. I checked in, grabbed the key, and headed to my room. Everything felt so mundane, but at the same time unreal, like I was going through the motions of someone else's life. I dropped my bags in the corner, sat on the bed, and pulled out my phone. I didn't know whether I expected to see a message from Lisa or if I was afraid of it. She hadn't given up yet. I knew she'd still try to contact me, to explain herself, to find a way to make it right, maybe even try to get me back. But I didn't want to hear it. I didn't believe her words anymore. And, just as I predicted, my phone vibrated. It was Lisa. "John, please talk to me. It was a mistake, I know, but I'm willing to make it right. Don't leave me." I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar wave of anger rising inside me. Her mistake had lasted for months. This wasn't some one-time moment of weakness. She had chosen to lie, to betray me over and over again, and now that she was caught, she wanted me to forgive everything. I typed a short reply. "There's nothing left to discuss, Lisa. We're done. I'm filing for divorce." I didn't know how she'd respond, but at this point, it didn't matter. I had made up my mind, and I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. Her choices had been made long before I found out, and now she had to live with the consequences. After sending the message, I turned off my phone and tossed it on the nightstand. I didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. I lay in the quiet hotel room, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, trying to gather my thoughts. Tomorrow I'd start my new life, file for divorce, split our assets, leave everything that reminded me of our past behind. But inside, there was something deeper than just anger at Lisa. Something gnawed at me that I couldn't shake off. The question of why kept eating at me. Why had she done it? Why had she chosen him, chosen the lies when we had everything? I had trusted her, given her everything I had, and she had chosen betrayal. I started to realize that it wasn't just about Lisa. This was her decision, but it reflected something bigger. Our life, our relationship that hadn't been as perfect as I thought. I had built an image of our marriage that I believed in, but in reality, something had been off for a long time, and I hadn't noticed. I hadn't wanted to see it. Lisa wasn't happy with me, and maybe I had been fooling myself into thinking everything was fine. It was a hard truth to swallow, but I knew that this was now a part of my new life. I had to keep moving forward, even if the path was rough. The next morning I woke up early. The sunrise poured warm light into the room, but inside, I still felt empty. I drank a cup of coffee, got dressed, and headed to the lawyer's office. The decision was made. I would file for divorce and we would never go back to what we once were. At the lawyer's office, the process was quick. I provided the necessary documents and signed the papers. The official process had begun. I didn't know how Lisa would react when she received the divorce papers, but that was no longer my concern. As I stepped out of the lawyer's office, I felt something new. Not joy, but peace. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The next few days passed in a strange, numb haze. I had already filed for divorce, and now all I could do was wait. I moved into a hotel temporarily to avoid going back to the house where every corner reminded me of Lisa and the ruins of our marriage. I tried to focus on other things, work, meetings, even thoughts about what the future might look like. But every time I was alone with my thoughts, they kept circling back to what had happened. Lisa kept messaging me even though I didn't reply anymore. Her texts were getting more desperate by the day. At first, she begged me to talk, promising that we could fix things. Then she started sending long explanations, how she had been confused, how everything had gone wrong, and finally, she started getting angry, blaming me for not giving her a second chance. One of her messages came a few days after I had walked out. "John, do you really think tearing apart our life is the right decision? I made a mistake, but you're not perfect either. You've distanced yourself from me over the years, and we both know it. Yes, I did something I shouldn't have, but we could have tried to fix it. You always said marriage is about working together. Now you're just gonna throw it all away? How can you do this? I sat in the hotel room, staring at my phone, trying to feel something. Anger, hurt, disappointment. But all I felt was cold indifference. Her words didn't reach me anymore. She thought she could manipulate me into believing it was my fault, that I was to blame for her betrayal. But I saw everything clearly now. This wasn't a mistake, as she kept calling it. This was a conscious decision to cheat and lie, destroying our life little by little. I didn't respond to her messages. We had chosen our paths, and I had already decided that I wouldn't let her affect me anymore. A few days later, I found out that Jake had been fired from the company. After the public reveal of their affair during that meeting, the management had no choice. He had tried to deny it, but there was no escaping the truth. The evidence was undeniable. His reputation was shattered. Lisa was still at the company for now, but I knew her days were numbered. Corporate life is brutal when scandals like this break out, and she wouldn't be able to maintain the image she had built for so long. I didn't take pleasure in it. It was just the natural consequence of their actions. They had destroyed their careers just like they had destroyed our relationship. Mark, our mutual friend, called me again to update me on the situation at the office. He didn't try to console me. He knew it didn't matter anymore. But we talked about life, about the future. He suggested we meet up to take my mind off everything. We met at a bar that evening. Mark looked more relaxed than before, but I could still see the same sadness in his eyes that I had felt myself. He had lost his illusions about Lisa too. She had been his friend just as much as she had been my wife. We sat there, drinking in silence for a while, exchanging short comments about the past. I didn't think she was capable of this, Mark said after a long pause, turning his glass in his hands. Neither did I replied shortly. But now it's all clear. We sat in silence for a while longer. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but there weren't any. Just the emptiness left behind after a betrayal. Have you figured out what you're going to do next? Mark asked after a few minutes. I shrugged. I didn't have a clear plan yet. All I knew was that life moved on, even if it wasn't the life I had envisioned before. Maybe that was a good thing. I no longer clung to the past, to what once was. My future was a blank slate. First, the divorce, I said, taking a sip of my drink. After that, I'll figure it out. Mark nodded, understanding. We talked about everything and nothing for another hour or two. But when I left the bar and returned to the hotel, I felt like I had closed a chapter of my life. This wasn't about Lisa anymore. This was about me. About how I had finally broken free from the circle of lies and disappointments. That night, back in the hotel, I turned off my phone and lay down in bed. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger or sadness or guilt. I felt a strange sense of calm. Tomorrow would be a new day, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it without fear, without anger, and without regret. Weeks went by slowly, but at the same time they passed quickly. I started getting used to my new life. My marriage with Lisa was in the past, just like the memories that once seemed important. It was a strange feeling, like you're coming back to yourself after a long journey but can no longer recognize the person in the mirror. I was living in the silence that follows a storm, but I wasn't trying to hold on to the life I once had. The divorce process moved quickly. Lisa and I agreed on splitting our assets, and I got half of what was ours. Of course, she tried to fight it. First through lawyers, then through emotional messages, but I stood firm. Our agreements were clear. We divided everything we could, and I walked away. We hadn't seen each other in person since the last confrontation. All communication went through our lawyers. She tried to reach out a few times, but I kept my distance. Lisa no longer had any power over me. Her betrayal had destroyed everything, and I had no desire to hear her justifications. I was free. Mark told me that she eventually left the company. Her reputation had taken too much of a hit after the affair was exposed, and no one wanted to work with her the way they used to. Jake had disappeared off the radar. After being fired, he didn't keep in touch with anyone, including Lisa, as far as I knew. They both paid for their choices, and although I hadn't sought out their downfall, it happened all the same. As for me, I started rebuilding my life. I found a new place to live, a small house on the outskirts of the city. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. It was a space where I could be alone, where there were no memories of Lisa, no echoes of our time together. I left everything that connected us behind. One evening, after everything was finalized, I sat on the porch of my new house, watching the sun set. For the first time in months, I felt a real sense of peace. There was no more tension, no more waiting for something to happen. Lisa was no longer part of my life, and that fact gave me the freedom I hadn't felt in a long time. I still thought about what had happened. You can't just forget years of marriage, even if it ended in betrayal. But now it felt more like memories of a past life, like watching an old movie where you're no longer the main character. It no longer had the hold on me that it used to. Mark called every now and then, suggesting we meet up. I started reconnecting with friends, slowly easing back into normal life. Work helped keep me busy too, and though it wasn't easy, I felt like I was finally moving in the right direction. One day, I saw Lisa by chance on the street. She looked different, not as confident as she used to be. She was walking briskly, not noticing me, and I felt a strange relief. I no longer held a grudge against her. I simply walked my own path. We were two people whose lives had split apart, and now each of us carried on with our own mistakes and their consequences. I no longer felt the need for revenge or exposure. Lisa and her betrayal no longer had any power over me. I had broken free from that, and now I could begin again. That evening, I turned off my phone and lay down in bed. Tomorrow would be a new day, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to live it fully, without fear, without anger, and without regret. Part 13, Starting Over. As the weeks rolled by, the sensation of starting over truly began to sink in. Each day felt like a fresh page, a chance to live without the weight of betrayal that had once consumed me. I hadn't spoken to Lisa since our divorce was finalized. The papers were signed, our assets divided, and we had both moved on separately. It was strange, really. After all the chaos and emotion, the ending was almost anticlimactic. I had expected some kind of dramatic closure, but instead, it felt like a slow fade, a gradual acceptance that the chapter of my life with Lisa was over. One day, I received an email from my lawyer. The divorce was officially finalized. The subject line read simply, "Your divorce is complete." That was it. For words to close out what had once been the most important relationship of my life. I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting the finality of it wash over me. And then, without a second thought, I deleted the email. I had moved into a new apartment in a different part of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was mine. My space, free from the memories of the life I had built with Lisa. The walls were bare for the first few weeks. I hadn't bothered hanging anything up. I didn't want to be reminded of the past. Didn't want any old photographs or decorations from the house we once shared. It was as if I needed a blank slate, not just in my surroundings, but in my mind as well. The apartment overlooked a park, and I often found myself sitting by the window, watching people pass by. There was something comforting in the ordinary, in the everyday lives of strangers. People walking their dogs, children playing, couples holding hands. It made me realize that life goes on, no matter what happens. No matter how broken you feel, the world keeps turning. And so, you have to keep moving forward too. I started going to the gym again, something I had neglected during the last year of my marriage. It wasn't just about getting back in shape, it was about rebuilding myself, piece by piece. Every workout felt like shedding another layer of the pain and betrayal I had carried for so long. I ran until my lungs burned, lifted weights until my muscles ached, and with each drop of sweat, I felt a little lighter. Work had been a welcome distraction. I threw myself into projects, took on new responsibilities, and for the first time in a long time, I found myself excited about the future. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the past crept up on me, when I thought about Lisa and everything we'd been through. But those moments were becoming fewer and further between. One evening, I received a message from Mark. He wanted to meet for a drink, catch up and talk about how things were going. I hadn't seen much of him since the divorce, though we'd kept in touch through texts and the occasional phone call. I knew he was one of the few people who had really been there for me during the worst of it. We met at the same bar we had gone to right after the whole thing blew up. Mark looked more relaxed this time, less tense than the last time we had met. We ordered beers and sat down at one of the booths by the window. "How's the new place?" he asked, taking a sip of his drink. "It's good," I replied. "Quiet. Feels like I'm finally settling into something new." Mark nodded, glancing out the window for a moment before turning back to me. "You look better, John. More at peace, I guess." "I feel better," I said honestly. "I think I'm finally letting it all go." Mark smiled, raising his glass. "To starting over." I clinked my glass against his, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. It wasn't that everything was perfect or that the pain had disappeared completely, but I knew I was on the right path. I had chosen to move forward, to rebuild my life, and that was what mattered most. We spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. Work, mutual friends, plans for the future. Mark had always been a good listener, and that night was no different. He didn't dwell on the past or ask too many questions about the divorce. He knew I didn't need that. Instead, he focused on what was ahead, on the possibilities that were now open to me. As we finished our drinks, Mark looked at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "John, I just want to say, you did the right thing. Walking away from Lisa, standing up for yourself. That took strength. A lot of people would have stayed, tried to fix something that was beyond repair. But you didn't. You chose yourself." I didn't know what to say at first. I had spent so long feeling like I had failed, like the collapse of my marriage was somehow my fault. But hearing Mark say that, hearing someone else acknowledge the strength it took to walk away, made me realize that maybe I hadn't failed at all. Maybe, in choosing to leave, I had saved myself. "Thanks, Mark," I finally said, meaning it. We left the bar that night with a sense of finality. Not just about the divorce, but about the chapter of my life that had closed. As I walked home, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the anger, the sadness, it was starting to lift. That night, as I lay in bed in my new apartment, I realized something important. I didn't need to have all the answers right now. I didn't need to know exactly where I was headed or what the future held. All I needed was the courage to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could do that. As time passed, I found myself thinking less and less about Lisa. The bitterness, the anger, they began to fade. It wasn't immediate, but with each passing day, the grip those emotions had on me loosened. I had built a new routine, a new life that didn't revolve around her or the betrayal that had shattered everything we'd once had. I still had moments where the past crept up on me. Sometimes, I'd catch myself thinking about what could have been if things had gone differently. But those thoughts didn't have the same power they once did. They were fleeting, like a distant memory that no longer held any real weight. I had started seeing a therapist shortly after the divorce was finalized. It wasn't something I had ever considered before, but after everything that had happened, I knew I needed help processing it all. Talking to someone who wasn't emotionally involved, who could offer an objective perspective, helped more than I expected. Through therapy, I learned to let go of the guilt I had been carrying. I had spent so much time blaming myself for what had happened, wondering if I could have done something differently, something to save my marriage. But the truth was I couldn't. Lisa had made her choices and I had made mine. There was nothing more to it. One afternoon, during one of my sessions, my therapist asked me a question that stuck with me long after I left her office. "What does your life look like now that Lisa is no longer a part of it? Not just in the day-to-day sense, but in the bigger picture. Who are you without her?" It was a question I hadn't really thought about. For so long, my identity had been tied to being Lisa's husband, to our shared life, our shared future. But now, without her, I had the opportunity to redefine myself, to figure out who I was, not as part of a couple, but as an individual. That question became a guiding force for me in the weeks that followed. I started thinking about what I wanted from life, what made me happy, what I was passionate about. For the first time in years, I was focused on my own needs, my own desires, without feeling like I had to compromise for someone else. I got back into hobbies I had long abandoned. I started writing again, something I hadn't done since college. I picked up photography, spending weekends exploring the city and capturing the world through my lens. It felt good to do something purely for myself, something that brought me joy. Work was going well too. I had thrown myself into my projects, and my efforts were starting to pay off. I was promoted to a management position, something I had been working toward for years. It felt like a validation of all the hard work I had put in, and for once, I allowed myself to be proud of my accomplishments. There were still challenges, of course. Moving on wasn't a linear process. Some days were harder than others, and there were still moments when the loneliness hit me. But those moments were becoming rarer, and I knew that I was on the right path. One evening, I received a message from Lisa. It had been months since we last spoke, and I hadn't expected to hear from her. The message was short, almost apologetic. "John, I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I hope you've found peace." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave it in the past where it belonged. But another part of me knew that I had already moved on, and I didn't need to carry any lingering anger or resentment. So I typed a simple reply. "Thank you. I hope you've found peace too." And that was it. There was nothing more to say. No long conversation, no rehashing of the past. Just closure. I put my phone down and felt a sense of finality wash over me. Lisa was no longer a part of my life, and that was okay. I had moved on, and now I was ready to fully embrace the future. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about everything I had been through. The pain, the heartbreak, the rebuilding. It had been a long journey, but I had made it through. I had come out stronger on the other side. And now, with nothing holding me back, I was ready to start living again. Months had passed since I received that final message from Lisa. By now, it felt like a distant memory, a chapter of my life that had finally closed. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, piece by piece, and for the first time in what felt like years, I was genuinely excited about the future. The new apartment had become my sanctuary. The walls were no longer bare. They were covered with framed photos I had taken, memories of the new life I was building. Friends had started visiting more often, and my social life was beginning to thrive again. It felt like I had finally reclaimed my identity, not as someone who had been betrayed, but as someone who had overcome that betrayal. I still thought about Lisa from time to time, but the thoughts no longer carried any emotional weight. She was simply a part of my past, a part of the story that had shaped me into who I was today. But she no longer had any hold over me. One weekend, I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains. It was something I had always wanted to do, but never found the time for. Now, with nothing holding me back, I packed my camera and set off for a few days of hiking in solitude. The drive was peaceful, the winding roads taking me further and further away from the city, from the life I had known. When I arrived at the cabin I had rented, I felt a deep sense of calm settle over me. It was just me, the mountains, and the open sky. I spent the next few days hiking through the trails, taking photos of the landscape, and breathing in the fresh air. It felt like a reset, a chance to truly disconnect from everything and focus on myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. On the last day of my trip, I sat on a rock overlooking a valley, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the world around me was quiet, except for the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. As I sat there, I realized something important. The past didn't define me. Yes, it had shaped me, but it didn't control my future. I had the power to choose what came next, to create a life that was entirely my own. I had survived the worst, and now I was ready to thrive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up, took a deep breath, and smiled to myself. This was just the beginning.